If you're looking for homeschool sanity, welcome. I'm Dr. Melanie Wilson, Christian psychologist turned homeschool mom and curriculum author. But I was once so disorganized, I thought I had to quit homeschooling and stop having kids. Now, by the grace of God, I have 6 homeschool graduates. Whether we're discussing parenting, productivity, or practical tips, I pray that this episode is just what you need for happy, healthy homeschooling. Hey homeschoolers, I had the opportunity to talk with my good friend, Dr. Carl Werner, for this episode. He is an expert in evolution who has devoted decades of his life to examining the evidence for evolution. His most recent book is about human evolution. The evidence he has amassed is stunning. Now more than ever, I believe we have to share his work with our kids. Here's my chat with Carl. Carl, I am so excited to have you as a guest again here on the Homeschool Sanity Show. And we are going to be talking about what should you teach your kids about human evolution in particular. And the reason I chose that as a topic is because early on in my homeschooling, a relative of mine who is not a Christian asked me that very question. What are you going to teach your kids about evolution? And I had a response, but my response would be so much more complex after getting to know you and all of the research that you have done on this issue. And so I wanted to share that with our listeners. Maybe our listeners today are just beginning their homeschool journey, or they haven't really thought about exactly what they're going to teach their kids about evolution and human evolution in particular. But before we do that, I want to share something fun with my listeners. You may have heard an advertisement for the movie upcoming, The Ark and the Darkness. They were a sponsor of my podcast last month. And so you probably heard those advertisements, but it was only after I had been advertising the movie that I found out that our dear friend, Dr. Carl Werner, is in the movie. And my husband and I have tickets to go and see it. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see it with Carl, but we are going to see the movie. And so you're going to want to see it too. Carl, can you tell us a little bit more about the movie and what people expect from it?
First of all, they have great CGI of how the Ark was built. They did a little CGI segment. It was about 3 minutes, and it is just beautiful. And it basically gives you a realistic appearance of what Noah's Ark would have been like, mixed in with scientists who believe in the worldwide flood and the evidence for it. So you get this mix of art and science and creation and God all in the one movie, and it's really good. I think you'll enjoy it.
Well, I think this is the first time that I know a movie star. So I'm just excited about that. I'm going to have to get your autograph, Carl.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. My wife says my head's going to get big, you know.
Well, I am really, really looking forward to it. And so I will put a link in the show notes again so that you can get tickets to see that movie as well. Well, let's jump in and start talking about human evolution. It is really something that is just assumed. It's established. It's a fact. It's no longer a theory. It is true that people evolved from primates. And we see evidence of this as an assumption everywhere we go. I remember years ago, I was at the zoo and there was a sign that said, "You might just be a monkey's uncle." And recently, someone was complaining of back pain. And they said, the reason that we have back pain is because we haven't been walking upright all that long. And our bodies just haven't adjusted to that. And I just was struck by this idea that It's of course, we came from primates. And I know, Carl, that you have traveled so many places around the world to multiple museums and dig sites and maybe even some zoos. You'll have to tell me if you've been to zoos as well around the world, but educational institutions where evolution, meaning human evolution, is depicted as fact. Can you give us some examples of what you have seen?
Well, generally, most museums will have a line, and it starts at an ape, and the line goes to these creatures with big names on them, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, et cetera, et cetera. And then the line goes to human, and it assumes that an ape evolved over millions of years into a human through the intermediate steps called ape men. Now, I call them ape men because your audience knows what that means. There's a scientific name for that, hominin, but who wants to be that confusing? So, yeah, and then they'll put out lots of skulls and fossils, and then most critically, they will draw the animal in an ape man position, not necessarily the fossils, but they'll draw the animal in an ape man position. So you just assume after seeing those displays, they're all true, but they aren't true. There's problems with each one of them. So,
and we're definitely going to get into that. And I'm excited to do that because I think it's just astonishing what you have uncovered in your research. But before we do that, before we talk about that in more detail, I want to go back and remind our listeners that you were not always skeptical of evolution. Can you just tell us how it came about that you started digging into this and researching it?
You would call me a first class nerd because in high school, I had my own animal lab at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And I was doing research on food preservatives. And I had this mice laboratory, and I was doing testing under the tutelage of one of the professors at University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Alan Derby, I think his name was. And then I won a 4-year full ride, meaning all tuition paid science scholarship. And then I also got into medical school at age 17. So I was the science kind of nerd guy. I couldn't pass a football. I couldn't play hockey. I couldn't shoot a basketball, even though I was on the team. But no, I was just a science guy. And also at that time, my faith was waning quickly. I grew up in a Christian family, but I just with the temptations of teenage years and the possibility that there was no God, my faith was waning quickly. And when my professors, the first day of medical school, first day of college, they were telling me that evolution was true. And, it sounded good to me. It made it easy for me because then I could amalgamate everything, my lack of faith and rejection of my family and the science, what is being taught to me, it all amalgamated until I was taken out to dinner by one of my medical school classmates in my sophomore year. So I was 19 years old, and he was in my class. He asked me out for pizza, and he asked me 3 questions that flipped me from being, I'll call it you could just say I was paganoid. Wasn't a God guy, and I was just doing my own thing for Carl Werner. It was all about Carl Werner. And he flipped me to believing in God with these 3 science questions. One question was, how do you believe in naturalism, that the universe began naturally since matter, like atoms, don't form naturally? That's the law of thermodynamics. And when he asked me that, I didn't know what the answer was. And then he asked me, how could life begin? Let's say the earth was, 5 billion years old and just chemicals and dust. How could the first living thing come about? Because he knew, and I knew from our biochemistry class that semester, that the large molecules, the DNA and the proteins and the enzymes, they just don't form under any conditions. So he asked me, how would life begin under your scenario of evolution or naturalism? And I didn't have an answer for that. And then his third question was why does a fossil record show gaps? Because there's over, now it's 1 billion fossils have been collected in the museums. That's billion. It's a lot of fossils, but yet the fossil record consistently doesn't show evolution from the big groups, like a dog type animal evolving into a whale and a mouse-like animal evolving into a bat, or a bacteria evolving into a coral or a sponge or an arthropod. And his questions were so powerful that even though I had all the evolution evidence in my mind, I said, it's not true. I don't know how it's not true, but these two things can't go together. You can't have these three questions unanswered and then still believe in this. So I just started my own experiment. I call it the grand experiment because it was so grand. It took me, 45 years of my life of just trying to investigate evolution. There has to be something wrong here, and I couldn't figure it out. And eventually my wife and I then did this 27-year traveling expedition, going to the museums, looking at the ape-man fossils, interviewing the scientists who had found them, like Lucy's scientist, Dr. Johansson. And we were all over South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, all throughout Europe, many times, South America. And then by the time I got to the end of that, I realized that the fossils, I know, hold on to your seat, this is going to be unbelievable, but the fossils were fraudulent. And there was serious problems with fraud. And that then explained to me, oh, that's what's going on. That's why they have this proof. But unless you had the resources, like I did, we didn't have children. I wasn't psycho with 6. I was sane with 0. That's the name of her other podcast, Psycho with 6, by the way. But I wasn't psycho with 6. I was sane with 0. And unless you were sane with 0 and you could spend, I'm not going to tell you how much it costs because it's embarrassing, gazillions of dollars, and go interview scientists with a science background, you could never prove this isn't true. But I did. And that is the conclusion. I know that's going to be hard to believe for many of your listeners, but that's what happened.
So, okay, let's go right to it, because aren't there just like so many? I mean, I don't know the number, but I mean, aren't there like hundreds of ape men fossils that prove that they are the missing link, though, Carl, between primates and humans, aren't they? But and if you say that they aren't, why is it that you say that they are not proof of human evolution?
First of all, I'd like to do that chart, which you're not old enough to remember, but the chart which came out in 1965, F. Clark Howell, with an ape evolving into a human with 14 animals in between. We interviewed him, surprisingly enough, and we learned that 10 of the 14 animals that he placed on that chart, they look like perfect intermediates, but he knew they were not. They were apes. 4 of those were apes, just ordinary apes, and 5 of them were ordinary Homo sapiens. When I mean ordinary, they were Homo sapiens. And there was one other, it was an outlier called Paranthropus. But those 10 animals, Dr. Wilson, he knew that they were not ancestors of humans, and yet he put them into this chart that we all learned from, and we still think that that chart is true, but the chart was fallacious. So there's one example, and I got 150 more such things. I have 150 frauds that we uncovered during this 27-year adventure that where each ape man you think of, like Neanderthal Man or Lucy, each had a fraud associated with it. And the frauds are stunning. I don't want to, my wife says I talk too much, Dr. Wilson. And she says, I just go on and it's a monotone. So I have to be careful not to just keep talking. But if you wanted to do one, like Neanderthal Man, I could tell you why it was a fraud. Or if you wanted to do Lucy, I could do that. Or, Homo habilis, I could do that. But the ape man that you're aware of all have fraudulent bases to them that 99.9% of the people on the earth do not know about these frauds.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, I could characterize what you said as the main problem being that when these ape men are presented as an intermediate between primates, apes, and people, that they actually are not, and they are either apes or people. And so, is that
Yes,
correct? Am I getting that?
that's correct. Except some of them, like I would say, okay, so I would say there is no such thing as ape man. 99%, or I'll say 80, 90% turned out to be apes
Okay.
or humans, but there were some outlier groups. Like one of the groups was, one of them was a reptile. It was a crocodile leg. And then there was this group of ape men that turned out to be ordinary mammals that weren't even primates, like dolphin, dog, cat, pig, horse, donkey. That would be a group that's not ape and not human. There was also another group that they were making them up out of monkey bone. So
Okay.
it's mostly ape, mostly human. There's some monkey, some reptile, some ordinary mammals, but there's 232 of these creatures that have been overturned so far,
Wow. Okay.
which is a
So
lot.
that is really a lot. So why don't you start with Neanderthal man and tell us why that
Yes.
that particular fossil, I guess that's what you would call it, is not an ape man.
Yes. Well, they initially found Neanderthal with just the skull bones, just limited skull bones. So they didn't know what it was. But in 1908, in La Chapelle aux Saints, France, they found a full skeleton. And that skeleton was handed over to the lead scientist at the Natural History Museum in Paris. His name was Marcel Boule. And this should have told everybody that there was a problem with it, because when other scientists came to see his skeleton, like Smithsonian scientists came over there by ocean liner 3 different times to see a skeleton, and he wouldn't let them see it. Now, that should be a hint there's something wrong. But in quick summary, this is what he did. At the bottom of a skull where the spinal cord enters is called this hole called the foramen magnum. And if in the human, it's kind of center, and in the ape, it's up here in the back. Marcel Boule from the Natural History Museum in Paris, moved the foramen magnum hole on the skull. And nobody realized it for 60 years, basically, because he didn't really show on the skull that these bones were missing. He could have put it anywhere, but he put it in the ape-man position, and then he filled in the cast, so it looked like there was no bones missing. That was one of the frauds. And another fraud was he took human neck bones and altered the drawing of human neck bones. So he didn't have to alter the Neanderthal, but he changed what a human looked like in the comparison drawings, and that made it look like it was an ape man. Then he took an ordinary lower leg bone called a tibia, which bent back, and he said that can't be from an animal that can walk upright, even though he had, at the catacombs in Paris, you can get your hands on 100,000 leg bones. I've walked through them, and they're everywhere. They're stacked as leg bones. And he knew that the leg bones in Paris of the modern French look like Neanderthal, but yet he said, no, Neanderthal's leg bone means he can't stand upright. So he made the whole case that Neanderthal looked like a gorilla bent over, and he made a big drawing in the Illustrated London News, only to find out that today evolution scientists portray Neanderthal no different than you or me. They would say, if they had a drawing, they'd say, oh, is that Melanie, or is that a Neanderthal woman? Or is that Carl, or is that a Neanderthal guy? That's how close they make Neanderthal look to human. And you can see those pictures in our book and video. And even at the evolution museum called Neanderthal Museum in Germany, they call them Homo sapiens. Oh, it went from an ape man to Homo sapien. And that's just one of all these frauds I'm talking about. They're crazy once you get access to the fossils and get access to the scientists, and they actually explain what happened. It's terrible. It's an indictment on this brand of science called human evolution.
Wow. And I mean, it's just, I remember when I first met you that my assumption was that scientists who found fossils of any sort knew so much more about analyze, and they did. I mean, I'm not going to say that they didn't, but they were so brilliant and so well educated that when they found a fossil, they could determine if it belonged to a modern day animal or person, or to a species of creature that doesn't even exist anymore. It's just completely different. And what you taught me is that when you're a scientist and you find a fossil, you get to decide what it is. You get to name it, even if it's identical to a modern creature. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And there's example after example after example of modern human evolution experts digging up recently buried humans, like grandma's grave or Uncle Bill's grave, or some local person's grave, digging them up, pulling the bones out and say, this is an ape-man bone. And I mean, I could list the species. It's Homo caput inclinatus, Homo cinnamenta, Homo pampeus, Homo crapensis. I mean, there's 5 or 6 of these where they dug up Uncle Bill's grave or Aunt Jane's grave and then said, oh, this is the missing link. And they publish it. And I mean, it's big stuff, Yeah, you made the big error on that assume word, because I'm not going to tell you how you break that word down. But and I've always assumed when I saw, like the diagrams of the teeth, and they say, see, this proves evolution. I say, I can't really see it, but they must know what they're talking about. I mean, I had that same approach, only 2 years later find out the whole tooth diagram that they showed me was baloney.
Yeah.
And I was a fool, actually, for giving him too much credence. Oh, it's a tooth evolution expert. He should know everything. So I just can't see it.
Oh, okay. So, Carl, tell us about another ape man that really struck you, the fraud, the errors that were made in putting it forward as proof of human evolution. What is one of your favorites?
Another favorite. I have so many, I can't choose between my children. I love them all, Another favorite of mine is Lucy. And nobody knows this information, Dr. Wilson. It was only obtained because we had the wherewithal to go interview Dr. Johansen, who found Lucy, and then to interview his partner, and then to go to Tanzania. His partner was in Paris, and then go to Tanzania to photograph the fossils from the Laetoli area. Johansen made the case that Lucy was an ape man. His number one priority was because the knee joint looked like a human knee joint. And he said this over and over and over. That was the basis of his case. And Debbie and I got in a plane. Debbie is my wife and partner in all this. We got in a plane, flew to Paris, and we interviewed his dig site partner. They were there together in 73, the year the knee was found. His name is Dr. Yves Coppens. And we turned on the cameras and we said, Dr. Coppens, tell us about the knee joint of Lucy. And we said, is it human or ape? Knowing that he's going to say human, because that's what I've heard my whole life. And this was in 2020, just before COVID and just before he died. And he said, no, Lucy's knee joint is ape. He said, it's not human. Now, that was the whole basis for Lucy, that knee joint. And Dr. Johansen made statements like, all analysis of the knee joint show that it's from a human-like creature. That was one of his frauds. Another fraud was then he took the pelvis of Lucy, and Lucy is an ape-like pelvis, and it's flat. I just so happen to have a pelvis here. Lucy's pelvis from the side looked flat, and he changed it from a flat pelvis and altered it, a plaster copy of it, cut it, and then changed it into a human-like pelvis where it goes forward, round. And the reason that was fraudulent is you just flipped the evidence. He said because the knee joint is from a human, then he would have to have a human pelvis. Now, that's circular reasoning. So I'm going to cut the pelvis and change it from ape to human. And then he hid the changes he made on the paintings and drawings. And the museums have also, not telling you that it was altered from ape to human. And then real quickly, lastly, his whole proof of Lucy being an ape man was that in Tanzania, they also found some Lucy-type fossils alongside these human footprints. And he wrote that the human footprints are only found with this animal called Lucy type. And so Lucy had to make the footprints. There was no humans there, But then Debbie and I got in a plane and traveled to Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, met with the director of the National Museum, had him show us all the fossils that were found next to those footprints. And the first one was a Lucy type. The second one was a Lucy type. Third one was a Lucy type. Okay, fine. It looks like it's pretty good. But when we got to the 18th one, that was Laetoli fossil 18, he pulled out a human skull, Dr. Wilson. Now, there was a human skull found at Laetoli, and that totally contradicts this argument that Lucy walked upright because Lucy fossils are the only kind of fossils found near these footprints. No, that's not true. So that appears to be 3 frauds. And nobody in your audience would know this, not even the college scientists, because they don't have the wherewithal to fly to Paris, fly to Tanzania, and to do a lot of comparisons, So it's almost like the Neanderthal guy. He just fraudulently made his case that it was an ape man, and he just made the evidence to fit, even if it didn't fit,
Right. Okay, so if I'm being skeptical of what you're saying, and then I come back at you and I say, well, okay, but those were only a couple of examples. Certainly there are real examples, multiple examples of fossils of ape men that prove human evolution. What would you say in response to that?
I'd say you're a doubting Thomas, and you'd probably want to put your fingers in Jesus' side when you saw Jesus return. No, to be honest with you, Dr. Wilson, I have the same spirit. I love your skepticism because it's very healthy for everyone to be skeptical of everyone, testing ideas, make sure it really does fit. And I love that sort of skepticism because it gets you closer to the truth. So even though we found 150 frauds, there are some ape men that you would say are still fairly well accepted and are not necessarily fraud. And I have a very good explanation for those. And this would only come from doing what we had done for those 27 years. There is a gap between when a fraud occurs and when it's discovered. And a lot of the frauds take 40 to 50 years to be uncovered. Some of them take 100 years to be uncovered, like Neanderthal. And I mean, it's like Nebraska man, it took 100 years to put that together, that story together. The reason you can't disprove these more modern ape men is because their colleagues of the scientists who discover the ape men will not criticize their ape man until the colleague dies. You see, there's over and over and over, we've talked to the scientists who said their colleague was a fraud, but they would only say that after the scientist died because there was fear of retribution. It's a very small field. You could lose your job. You could get your papers not published in Nature because someone's telling them don't publish this guy. So there's a lot of fear of retribution. And so they will not publicly criticize, as a general rule, I'm not saying all the time, but as a general rule, they will not publicly criticize the scientist until he's dead. So you will never be able to disprove the theory, which is a sign of it's a false theory, because the ape men of the last 40 years tend not to be disproven too much. But even the latest one that we did interviews for, Toumai, that's Toumai, that one was 4 frauds too, and it was just discovered in 2001,
Wow. Okay, so the fossils that have been debunked as missing links, I'm sure those are all on display in museums of natural history and other places with a nice placard that explains how the fraud took place and that these are not proof of human evolution, correct? Is that what you see?
I think you're baiting me because you're saying that the scientists at the museums who are in charge of the display would want to educate the public that these 40 or 50 fossils over here. We all believe they were human evolution ancestors, but they've all been disproved. And so here's a sign. This one was this fraud. This one was this fraud. This one was a mistake. This one turned out to be a monkey. This one turned out to be a dolphin. And so being the scientist who does the museum displays, I want you, patron of the museum, to be careful here because we might be telling you a fib. No, none of that. Zero education of the public. In fact, it's all swept under the rug because their main thing is their worldview, and that worldview is atheism. I hate to say that, but most of these human evolution experts are atheists. And that would say our main thing is to teach you about evolution at all costs, even sometimes at a little loss of integrity, but we're not going to tell you about our mistakes of the past. And that's a sign there's something wrong. You'd be very candid if you were confident of your theory. They're not.
Right. So because our museums and our evolution scientists are not being honest with the public and sharing all of the fraud and it wasn't all fraud, right? I mean, sometimes people were just mistaken about what they found, but they're not educating.
There's only
what were you going to say?
That's right. There's only 150 frauds, but then besides the frauds, there's no, I'm serious. There's only 150 frauds, but there's also this number. There was mistakes, there was 41,000 mistakes on when they picked up a rock and said it was a stone tool. There was 41,000, but that would be more like mistakes. And then there was these 132 ape men that were disproved that turned out to be other kind of animals, but it wouldn't necessarily be fraud. They're just overzealous. So you got frauds, you got mistakes, you got overzealous, but it's all of that gets lumped into human evolution.
Right. Well, I'm really glad that you clarified that. But I know, Carl, that you feel it's very important that we tell the truth about what has been found. And because our institutions of science and learning are not doing that job, you have taken it upon yourself to do that, to help educate people about the truth of human evolution and its evidence or lack thereof. Can you tell us how you have sought to do that?
Well, we put together a television miniseries. Again, you would call that kind of a nerdy, geeky kind of guy. Oh, I also, besides having an animal lab, I also put together a television miniseries on human evolution. I wasn't drinking too many beers at the bar. I was making a television miniseries. So that was one thing where all the things I just talked about are on videotape when the scientists are admitting they committed fraud, when the scientists are accusing their colleagues of committing fraud. It's a learning moment for the public to see the scientists admitting or accusing fraud. And so that was one component, was to do all these interviews and put them together in a PBS style or Discovery Channel style, high quality television show. And the other thing is we then also wrote the material up in 2 books on human evolution. This is one of them. It's a gorgeous book. It's called Untold Stories of Human Evolution. And what we did is, nobody's going to get access to these fossils again, probably for another 30 years after what we did. What we did is we published the photographs of the fossils and newspaper articles and put them side by side with the scientist interviews. I'm not hitting any, there's some fossils there, so that nobody has to ever do this again. If somebody wants to really get to the root of it, they just read these 2 books. They're only a couple hours to read. There's 1,000 pictures in each book. And there you go. You can just, if you really have a little interest in it, or your kid has a little interest in human evolution or ape man or creation, let them at it, and they will be able to process this information, not with me sitting over their shoulder telling them. They can figure it out for themselves when they see the fossils. It's very clear.
It really is. I mean, based on your previous books, I haven't even had a copy of your most recent book in my hands, so that needs to change, right, Carl? I have to get a copy.
Exactly.
But why do you think it's so important for us to make sure that our kids are educated on this topic?
Not to be dramatic, but I would tell the kids themselves, you're being hunted.
Mm.
Um, you don't realize that society and people in society are hunting you. You're one of those Christian children who believe in creation or believe in God, and they want to flip you to believing in atheism. So they're going to start in first grade or kindergarten, and every year thereafter, they're going to inundate your kids with the proofs for evolution. They did it to me in college, and I believed them only to find out later that those proofs were fraud. And your kids are going to be flipped. I just hate to predict that, but if they're a good family, Christian believing, and they go to college and they got the temptations of, just temptations of life, and then all of a sudden they are inundated with proofs that they can't hold their own on, they're going to be flipped. And flipped, I mean, rejecting God and kind of rejecting you and rejecting your family, and their life's going to be a disaster. I'm just speaking from my own experience. That's what happened to me. Mm. And, if you take those same kids and start them in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, you could even start them in high school and just go through like our 4 semesters of creation science using our really gorgeous books. The kids love it because they can give reason why they believe what they believe and why evolution doesn't work. And I've overheard conversations from, in the blogosphere of my kid was at the baseball game with his little friend, and they're in 7th grade, and my son was telling him why, these parts of evolution don't work. And they're doing this over the baseball game at a National League game, See, you would make him so spiritual because he then would have reason for what he believes. He'd be prepared with an answer. And it can't be just a sermon. No offense. I don't want to offend anybody, but I don't think it can be just done with a sermon. God created you, and that's the truth, so just believe it. That is the truth. There is that level of truth. But really, at this point in 2024, at this late age, we need to say, God created you, and that's true. But here's the evidences for it. And then, just go on. And so that the kids, especially if they take it in a curriculum where they're tested on it, like what are the concepts, they could spit it out. And then when they get to college or high school or grade school or first grade, not the first graders, but when they get there, when the professor says, the earth formed from a big bang, 17 billion years ago, the kid raised, could you explain to me where the matter came from for the big bang, professor? Because I've never understood how matter could form itself. Your kids will be able to do that, and, when your professor's starting to talk about the ape man, could you explain to me why there's so many frauds and why Neanderthal Man turned out to be a fraud? What does that mean about the area? Your kids could have so much fun, and they would be little evangelists, but it's going to take, I'm kind of, I don't want to overspeak here, but I'm kind of discipling the moms and dads. I'm saying, okay, this is the truth, and here's the facts. You got to study this, like reading this, and then you then become the discipler, and your kids become the disciples, and you then explain it to them and teach it to them through these courses. And then all of a sudden this atheism will disappear quickly because you really can't stand on atheism in a logical sense,
Absolutely. Well, I don't think that's a misstatement to say that is exactly what you are doing. I think it's very easy for anyone to feel intimidated when someone starts talking about it could be science, it could be mathematics, it could be any field that you aren't as educated in, and they start to say, oh, well, these are all the things that you don't know. And that's why you believe in God. That's why you believe the way that you do. And, it's just so clear. And I love that we can turn the tables on that with your materials, because you have provided us now with information that the people challenging us don't know. Most likely they have no idea. I mean, I have done this before, Carl, with what you have taught me, not about human evolution in this example, but about this theory that a wolf evolved into a whale. And when I have told people this, they say, no, that's not the theory. And I say, yes, it is. and you need to, look into it because people think that's ridiculous. But isn't that what is part of their theory, right?
It is. Yeah. The mesonychids evolved into a whale. The mesonychids look like, a cat or a wolf. Yeah. The wolf or cat evolved. It changes every year, but the wolf or the cat, or the dog evolved into the whale.
Yeah,
or it might have been a hoof mammal, but one of those four.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
Oh, it could have been the odd toad.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Carl, it is always it's a joy to talk with you every time. It's not only educational, but it's inspirational. And I know that your heart is for people to know God and to know that they are created in the image of God and that they're not monkeys' uncles. So thank you so much. And I want to end by having you tell us where we can pick up your fabulous books and videos.
The clearinghouse for finding my material is my website, thegrandexperiment.com. There's no spaces, thegrandexperiment.com, and she can put a link on it. And there you can just find, if you're just an adult without kids, you can find just the books, or if you're a homeschooler, you can find the 4-semester curriculum, and you just order it off the website, or the website will take you to a place where you can get it. And also there at that website, there's a link that takes you to the TV series or DVD series, and you can either get the 8-part DVD series or you can watch the shows, the 8-part series online, all from that website. So that's really the only address you need.
Oh, perfect. Well, I absolutely will put that link in the show notes. Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. To find the link to The Ark and the Darkness, my previous conversation with Carl, and his materials, visit the show notes at homeschoolsanity.com/human evolution. Have a happy homeschool week. Be sure to come by and say hello if you're attending the Great Homeschool Convention in Greenville, South Carolina. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I hope something you heard was encouraging. If you have a personal question to follow up, don't hesitate to message me. I'm at Homeschool Sanity on social media. Be sure to check my free resource page at homeschoolsanity.com/resource and find sanity-saving curriculum at funtolearnbooks.com. This has been a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network.